And now we are back into the Discourse episode of this week. This Discourse is about RSP's take on religion in the news. And I'm happy to have a very diverse table of guests with me, mostly from Latin backgrounds, Latin America and Romania. So this is quite a diverse table. I'm happy to be hosting this one, coming from Peru as well. So it's a very, very exciting.
Something like a long distance family.
Exactly. The long lost cousins from one side to the other. And I'm Sidney Castillo, associate editor at the RSP. I'm also from Peru and currently studying a PhD in social and cultural anthropology at the University of Helsinki. So now I would like to welcome all of you, Juan Manuel, Stefanie, and Maria Nita. And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great for our listeners to get familiarized with who you are and what do you do.
Great. I'm Maria Nita, and I'm a lecturer in religious studies at the Open University. Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm an MSc in social anthropology, religion in the contemporary world here at the LSE in UK, and where I also studied public policy analysis. So I currently work for the University of Santiago de Chile as an academic editor, and I currently live in London. Yes.
And hello, my name is Juan Manuel Rubio. I'm from Bogota, from Colombia. I'm a PhD student at the Medieval Studies Department at the Central European University here in Budapest and also in Vienna. I research mostly about religious history in the Middle Ages, mostly centered around the phenomenon of the Crusades. But I also very interested in the way in which the Middle Ages and medieval topics, including medieval religion, is portrayed in popular media, films, movies, video games, streaming shows. So that's my connection to religion, to this side. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Excellent. Very interesting. So we have a very, very diverse topic to discuss today. Now we are going to jump into the discussion. So I think Maria wanted to talk about COVID and religious festivals.
Yes, we had so when I introduced myself, I didn't mention that this was the Open University in the UK. So I live in the UK, but I'm Romanian, so hence the Latin connection. We had a conference last week on festivals, kind of cancelled and virtual festivals this year, 2020. And it was really interesting, because different participants talked about, a variety of responses, in the UK and abroad. On one hand, religious festivals that had to be cancelled and the kind of reactions to that. Obviously, as the whole spectrum of reactions from, we've got to have we have to host the festival even if we have to keep, social distance, or, on the other hand, it's fine to celebrate this particular, whatever festival at home. And so all these different, ways in which religions had to adapt this year, with COVID. To kind of celebrate the religious festivals. I think it's really interesting, and the discourses that, talking about discourse, that kind of came out from that. It's really very interesting. On one hand, it's interesting to see how some religious leaders had to compromise, and the language they used to advise people not to attempt to kind of celebrate together, and this idea that, you can be spiritual with, and connect with people virtually or connect with people through, digital apps. So, the fact that some people embrace that, whilst others, couldn't get their head around that. And, it was all about kind of, when can we go back to church? When can we, resume our activities as they were before? I think that, these two attitudes are really interesting. I don't know if you've encountered this sort of kind of discussions and negotiations in.
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is true, and it's actually very interesting. I actually remember seeing some time ago some news in Colombia, which was like this big scandal because the COVID situation in Colombia was very bad until very recently, and the government was trying to implement all these measures to try to flatten the curve. And one of the groups that was most resistant to this was religious groups, Catholics, and also more conservative Christians that are starting more like evangelicals that are starting to appear in Latin America. And it actually makes you think about several things because you kind of I believe that one kind of sees the point in these communities that are demanding their right to celebrate their ceremonies because religion is to some extent a communal activity. It's a group that shares certain rituals and a set of beliefs, which to some extent I think makes you wonder what is it to be a community in an age in which you could potentially have this online.
Yeah.
And also considering that today, in our secularized societies, religion is mostly seen in the first place as an individual activity. It's your individual beliefs, but still these individual beliefs, which in theory, you should be able to celebrate them by yourself, are deeply connected to this more larger, broader communal element that really comes into struggle with the COVID situation.
And one thing that I noticed, because I've been doing some online research with Green Christians in the UK, and one thing I noticed, kind of not only in this context, but in others as well, is that people have been able to form interest groups, as a result of COVID, and they kind of come together for a particular purpose, to support each other, not only, because of COVID or the lockdown, but, something else. I don't know, whether they had, a particular campaign that they wanted to get online. So in a way, the lockdown was slightly kind of celebrated as well, in some circles for kind of allowing that kind of remolding, of the community in different and people kind of adjusting to this and going online and connecting virtually, which is interesting as well. Yeah.
Exactly. It reminds me a lot of what Daniel Hervieux wrote about like lean as a chain of memory, that even individuals, they are so individual. Well, it was for another context. But she wrote that individuals, even because they are so individual, they even want to share their own individuality with other like-minded people.
Yeah.
Like in this case, COVID has allowed the visibility to see effectively how people can relate to one another despite distances and despite not socially gathering as they used to do. So it's allowing also all of these virtual communities to take more form and more almost like institutionalized.
Yeah.
Institutional way to be more consolidated in some way.
Yes, it's strange because it seems to, in a way, I'm sure that the kind of reactions to COVID, follow trends that were already there, and so, like you said, like this individualism and so on. So, people can respond in ways that kind of already feel familiar. But yeah, it's really interesting. I wrote a little blog about giving communion in Romania because at the beginning of the lockdown, there were a few articles online about the fact that priests or some priests, not all priests, but some priests continued to to give communion to, obviously using the same spoon.
Right.
Or kind of in rather unsafe ways, not kind of reacting to the COVID restrictions. And the articles said that the patriarch hadn't made a kind of a statement about COVID. Obviously he had. I mean, he has since, but that was the first. It was an interesting situation that the Romanian church, which is an autocephalous, right? It's an independent Orthodox church. didn't kind of react to the governmental advice and waited for, the patriarch to make a statement. And when that, and I found it really interesting because, it kind of shows that there are, that it has, or religion, let's can't talk about religion in general, but religion in this context had its own kind of, links of authority and resistance, in a way resisting the governmental advice because it has its own hierarchy and its own kind of channels of authority. It was really interesting in terms of kind of its history, during the communist times in Romania, and that was definitely the case. The Orthodox Church had to resist, the government in a way.
Exactly.
I
I
actually
remember
believe
it's
that
yeah.
part of
Go on.
resistance. Were you speaking, Sidney? Or
No, it's all right. Go on.
okay, no. One of the things that when Maria mentioned that is very interesting is precisely this kind of element of resistance to these measures that have been. I mean, the wrong. I don't think if they would be imposed, but okay, let's use the word that were imposed on religious services and religious activity during the COVID situation. Because Maria mentioned the case, of course, of Romania, which has its own patriarch that decides. But it also makes me think a lot of the more viral on the social networks of, for example, anti-maskers in the United States. Of course, I'm not saying that they're necessarily protesting or resisting from a religious point of view, but these groups do seem to share
Yeah.
a broader religious frame, conservative,
Mm-hmm.
evangelical, which at the end, and I
Right.
think this makes the question to some extent, uh, considering the role that faith and religion plays in people's life, to what extent can a person who is deeply religious and a very serious practicant of their religion just say these measures are going against whom I very much are? Because it gives me the impression that in the case of the United States, it's all like conflated into one. So not wearing the mask is standing for liberty, for the American way, and for the Judeo-Christian values that conservative
Right.
evangelicalism in the United States represent.
Very interesting.
Right. I remember seeing one post as related to, well, in the Orthodox Church in Georgia, that also, because here is well also not only the authority issues, but also the justifications of the contents itself that the authority says for carrying out this gathering still is like one of the priests was saying that, yeah, we are continuing to give through the spoon the communion, because before every person comes into the front of the spoon, the light of God descends and it's like burns with 100 degrees Celsius, so it sterilizes it that way, and it proceeds. We can proceed to give to the next communion to the next person. So it was also like some kind of heuristic resources
Yeah.
to try to justify their own course of action.
Yeah.
But I would like now to go to the direction of Stefanie, because she's going also to share a little bit about the situation in Chile with the COVID and the indigenous peoples, which I think is a very interesting thing to delve into.
Thank you. Well, this has very much to do with what Maria just talked about. The ways that religions or smaller groups have had to adapt themselves. She said through discourse and in this current pandemic situation, and they've had to do it by means of virtually. And I also question what individualism means, right? When maybe we talk about the evangelics, that in other spaces and like in Chile, they've been very stigmatized, and young people too, yeah, because of their reunions and non-compliance to the policies. But there's also an interesting bridge between what we think that they are taking as individual actions and behavior. um, I also question how the policies are also set up, specifically the health ones, that are also based on individualism. in their health points of views. So broadly, I want to talk about the importance of the multidisciplinary and inclusive approaches that public policies should consider in order to provide more equitable conditions to minorities and indigenous groups in Chile in this setting. But also, it also extends to religious groups. So, the Chilean Health Authority has taken measures to contain the epidemic. And they've, of course, derive out of public health strategies that we know and that they've been taken here also in UK and elsewhere that have been proved to be somewhat efficient. And they've all been recommended by the WHO, such as social distancing, as well as total and partial quarantines. So how to relate back to what I was saying about individualism, these strategies that are specifically in the public policy health sector can lead us also to reflect on the assumptions that the biomedical work that is based on populations that correspond specifically to homogeneous groups of people. So all of these are set to target homogeneous groups. And so this is where the management of the individual behaviors is the main variable that affects health outcomes. At least that is how it's perceived. So as I was saying, that biomedicine is a branch of the medical science that applies to the biological and the physiological principles, and it sets it to work in the clinical practice. And it is there where it stresses and standardizes evidence-based treatments that are validated through its biological research. So, as I was mentioning, this specific view is deeply rooted in public policies and in scientific work that assume the role of social and cultural phenomena that's pertaining to health behavior of human groups as a secondary priority. Yeah, and in certain places, if it's considered as one at all. So, specifically, health anthropology is concerned with this field of action that places the emphasis on the fact that the human body and its symptoms are interpreted through the cultural filters, knowledge, epistemological assumptions, and that these help to shape the networks of meaning from which individuals and groups make and take their health decisions. So, however, along with health anthropology, I think that many interdisciplinary fields, such as those that specialize in the study of religion, should take part in the debates of public policy approaches that strive to understand the needs of minorities and the ethnic groups amid the strategies that aim to tackle our current setting of our pandemic. So this implies understanding the social, cultural, and religious aspects that lead to specific behaviors around a health, disease, and care cycle of these groups. And that we know that not always follow unidirectional logics, nor solely guided by scientific evidence, as, of course, we know many policies suggest, and which are often very inaccessible to populations. So in this sense, there are various critical aspects where a multidisciplinary knowledge approach would be important in these circumstances, and that need to be considered, I think, in a crisis management, in a health crisis setting, whether it be in a pandemic or not. So briefly, these critical aspects relate to mainstream assumptions. Yeah, these assumptions are that, firstly, diseases are understood as an individual phenomenon. Yeah, like we talked before. Secondly, it relates to the ignorance of the importance of a community health approach. And thirdly, to the exclusion of communities and their internal diversity from health participation mechanisms. So these three specific views mainly derive from the lens of individual behaviors. And it's taken as a strategy to achieve or regain health. So while this approach is a feature of what I explained of biomedicine, the form it takes varies, of course, in different societies, and it depends on the public health approaches that are promoted in each of these societies. So in Chile, the consequences of this view has led people to believe that their health conditions depend exclusively on their own behaviors and decisions, And so we can see this through the policy campaigns that we've also seen here in UK and in Europe that use a choose to live healthy slogan, for example, and that are also somewhat aligned to policy protocols that today aim to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 through messages such as wash your hands and stay at home. Right. So the consequences of this approach, which is quote unquote individualistic approach, impact the segments of the population that live under the precarious conditions of the public health system, and that also fall under the greatest lack of resources, as groups. So these are specifically the ones that have the highest risk of contracting coronavirus, and of course many other health conditions. So in Chile, this lens and policy lenses, it places the country in a complex setting to tackle this pandemic, concerning the lack of multidisciplinary studies, including statistics and policy measures that bring the structural and the social cultural dimensions into existence. So this omittance of not having all of these lessons together, all of these views, it prevents the state and the political actors from understanding why freedom of choice does not really exist, and many, worse yet, assume that it does. What I wanted to talk about is that this situation is reflected in what is happening in a region called the Araucanía region, which is a territory with a high number of confirmed cases and deaths associated to COVID. And it makes it very clear that the most affected population are those belonging to social groups in the greatest conditions of vulnerability due to poverty, gender, disability, and or belonging to indigenous groups. So little attention has been paid to the actions that extend to those territories, which is in the southern part of Chile. And so far, the ones promoted have openly ignored the possibility of involving these communities in participatory processes, and thus they have deprived them of the right to be part of health decisions. So these communities have been called to sort of obey, actions that have been promulgated top down, vertically, by groups and these lenses of the biomedical field and political decision makers that comply with these lenses, and who all these actors have had very little contact with the multiple internal diversities that inhabit the Chilean territory. So it talks about, the idea is that this individual way of seeing health is certainly, it certainly affects all of the most vulnerable economical and minorities and indigenous communities in Chile. So I guess if we have an understanding of health and the interpretation of diseases as being part of highly defined processes that are determined by the social, cultural, the religious, historical, economic, and political variables, then it's easier to conclude that, for example, the voice of a religious leader or an indigenous health agent may well have an influence on the behavior of a specific community. And an influence that can also be positive. It can bring positive outcomes by means of inclusion with these actors that promulgate health decisions, rather than having a top-down and top-bottom, and homogeneous rules, and regulations. So ultimately, this would help to translate into policy measures that would target equity and health while aiming to decrease the spread of COVID-19, through integration. So ideally, the existence of a more widespread medical pluralism, alongside integration of the indigenous, religious, and migrant traditions to face this process, which is the health, illness, and care cycle, with accompanied by, by multiple perspectives, should be considered and used as resources to create common strategies. So I found some examples of policies that are moving forward bit by bit now in Chile. Mm-hmm. So a month ago, thanks to the voicing of these specific concerns through sociocultural and anthropological studies, they were able to, study and work on some regions where Mapuche and Huilliche communities live. And the Chile's Ministry of Health incorporated a special protocol for their funerals with the purpose of respecting and safeguarding their cosmovision. So, for example, the new protocol implies that these communities, they can bring food to feed the funeral attendees, but they have to determine specific spaces to place the food, and they have to avoid the sharing of utensils, while complying with the measures of social distancing. But they may hold these gatherings and bring food as they have always done, with their funerary customs. And well, they may also carry out like their performance of ceremonies if it's needed at their homes in an outdoor space, which was prohibited before. So these measures are, they were not set, to work from the very start, because this pandemic setting has also, it's also highlighted. It hasn't brought new what's it called? New aspects in a way. It's just that the old ones that were there, they're highlighted through this pandemics. For example, inequality, of course, with these specific groups. So another interesting thing that I found, there were some recommendations for public policies that the LSE Department of Anthropology wrote at the start of the pandemic here in UK. So they examined how communities were already adapting to the processes of dying, burial, funerals, and bereavement, and how they were responding to new government regulations. So based on what they found, they recommended inclusive and very practical ways to handle health crises among these groups, so to better inform the policymakers and safeguard this cycle, the health, disease, and care prevention, among the religious communities and minorities here in the UK. So there are various ways where diverse expertise in different fields they can come together and set out their views, and not only their views through academic papers, but set them out as recommendations and voice them to the political actors and policymakers. So that's that's the way I see that everyone, including the religious study field, of course, and through anthropology and other and other studies that pertain these areas, they can engage a bit more during these settings and in their expertise.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
I think it's a very, very interesting approach. So more of a dialogical rather than prescriptive or normative from bottom up. From top down. I remember seeing something related to that in Indonesia, at least, that with religious-related practices. So in some small villages in one of the islands in Indonesia, they were trying to, as part of the initiative of the municipality, they were using like kind of ghost scares for people to stay at home. So they were like literally scaring people away, dressing as a ghost. Some of them like were leaders from the neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
Or representatives, and they were like doing that, and it was like the success rate was quite high for that. So it worked even better than if you presented it in a dry, like very like formulaic way. You have to stay at home or whatever. If you appeal to people in a different way, it could be like in a different epistemic register. It could be more successful, as you're saying. I think.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a little far-fetched, a little bit, but I understand.
Yeah,
I think one of the main points is to have an inclusive approach with the voices of community leaders, for example, and so they can go and take part of these discussions with these policymakers, for example, and with the health, the health medical actors. So that they can contribute to each other in the prevention, because you have to think that many countries, for example, if they say, wash your hands, as often as you can, you have communities in Chile and in many other settings where they don't have water, or they're going through droughts, right? You have to take special measures and in order to avoid the spread of COVID. And that's something that seems obvious, but in many countries, and it's been very hard for Chile to tackle these issues. And it's not a coincidence that the region where the Mapuches are, mainly in the ninth region in Chile, they are the ones that have had the highest spread and deaths and of COVID, because it's all very not only centralized, but the vision is very individualistic. And what you need with certain communities is a communal approach, and to also take into account and include their ways of how they take their hygiene, for example. If certain communities make their own soaps, for example, you need to provide things that are lacking, and you can't just impose if you don't have, basic resources or even more.
Yeah, I actually, like you mentioned several things that I thought were pretty interesting. On the one hand, because what you're saying, it's also something that is happening in Colombia. In Colombia, the indigenous population is not very big, but is there around still, if I'm not wrong, and I might be wrong because I'm not an anthropologist, is around 10% of the population. And many of these communities are the most harshly hit by the pandemic, not only because they are in remote areas where the state has little to no presence, but also, as you mentioned, because sometimes the whole cultural approach is very different. While, as you said, Western medicine is very individualistic and very much dealing with the disease at the personal level. These are communities, and in Colombia it happens, in which the community is more important. Sometimes even several of these communities have communal ownership of the land, so they do work under a different perspective. But that made me wonder something, and it's, I don't know what is the case in Chile or in Peru, but at least in the case in Colombia, the constitution that actually recognized these peoples as different cultural identities that have a right to exist within the country was in 1991, and it was a very strong and very harshly fought struggle to get these rights for these people, which was great. But I bring it up because it makes me think of something, and is that the Constitution granted to these communities a level of autonomy, and in some issues of policy. So, for example, if a member of this community commits a crime, they are first judged by indigenous law before by the Colombian state law, which I think one could argue has led to some extent to these groups to be more, well, not more, but somehow disconnected from the rest of society. Not now because they are not recognized, but not that because they are recognized to the point that their own practice kind of isolate them, and that can actually be like a negative consequence of this type of struggle. Because in the case of the pandemic, it can come into clash with policy from the state that does not take into account the perspectives of these communities, but also these communities have their own practice that are already legal. So how do you approach them?
Well, in the case in Chile, they don't have a special for certain things, because law is very broad too, right? So for certain things, they're under a common law, but they've also each community also has their history and struggles with the state, of course. So this particular community has had a lot of the Mapuches, which are the most vulnerable ones. They've been, for example, they've tried to take out laws of terrorism, for the first time, and to put them on them, for certain things that are that haven't even been proved to be necessarily 100%, factual, of burnings of certain houses or lands. And so they've had this struggle for decades, and historically it's been very, very rough on them, because they haven't even complied. The Chilean state hasn't complied with their compromises with international recommendations, let's say, right? Like the ones from the ONU. How would you say that? The ONU? It's the
United Nations.
The United Nations, the UN. And the OIT, the work agency from the United Nations. And so they've been bypassing all of these recommendations, and at the same time they are state members, And so there has been a huge breach of, and an ethical breach of the ways that they could manage the circumstance by integrating, and not by, for example, putting militia, putting their military in this region specifically during COVID, right? Because that's actually one of the recommendations of the UN for all of the countries that have indigenous communities, is to avoid to put military presence there, because it does not help at all. It does not only not help, it brings distrust, and it carries along more breaches of communication and participation. So this is exactly the opposite of what Chile has been doing in the last month. And now you have a bit more voices, not only from the academia, but the indigenous associations that are actually trying to come to middle terms, right? Because they're not saying at all that this doesn't exist. I don't know in other countries, but they are trying to comply as best as they can. But at the same time, you can also adapt COVID measures, the mainstream ones that the WHO recommends. You can also adapt them to particular funeral rites. You can keep having social distancing, but that doesn't mean that you have to annul all of the practices. So it's how to come to these, middle grounds. But in order for that to happen, you need to have their voices out and integrated, right? If you don't shorten that breach, then all you will get is hostility on both sides, and you'll get these people to be even more stigmatized.
I think that what you're saying is very interesting. It's actually a little bit funny, because everything that you're saying that is happening in Chile is also already happened in Colombia to these indigenous communities that are very far away or in remote areas. Sometimes the answer of the government was just to send the military and establish a curfew, and that's it. And that's the other thing that I really found very interesting, and is this individual versus communal approach to medicine, because it's not only in the measures, it gives me the impression, it is also in the individualization of responsibility if you get sick. Many, for example, you said, like, and it also happens in Colombia, that the government says, like, wash your hands as many times as you can, and sometimes people don't even have the water to wash their hands.
No.
But still, because the problem is seen from an individual perspective, if that person gets sick, it's still that person's fault for not taking care enough by themselves, because it is an individual problem. And the funny thing is that when the whole pandemic, for example, in Colombia began, you could see a lot of Facebook posts and tweets from Colombian people, many of my friends, saying, like, you have to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself and you get sick, let me remind you that it is your fault. You're not a victim. You could stay at home. You could wash your hands. When the first question should be, does everybody have the freedom to make that decision,
They
including
don't.
indigenous groups, but also including poor people who have to go out to work every single day? So
Of
this
course.
individualization is not only like from the measures, but also from the responsibility. If you get sick, it's not because you're in poverty, or because you have a different cultural framework, or because you approach medicine from a different point of view. It's because you were not responsible enough for yourself.
Exactly, individually.
I would like to bring, I think Maria wants to say something about the topic.
No, sorry. I was just in agreement, and I was just thinking that it's that I was just thinking about that in terms of discourse, and this idea of kind of responsibility for your health. I think, oh God, who wrote this great book on health and body? I'm thinking about a discourse theorist. Sorry, it's escaping me at the moment. But this idea that we've become responsible for our health has been with us for some time now. So in a way, for our health and for our, and kind of death as well being a kind of result of how well we take care of our bodies.
It's very it's a very complex topic, because we all know that many groups, not only indigenous groups, you can't just say easily, and through these really these not only a lot of people don't even have access to internet in these groups, right? And so, or electricity, right, or water. So and they depend, for example, on markets that are not formal. So if they sell in markets, so they're not with legal contracts at all, where you can have, for example, here furlough, right? And so when you say stay at home, it's like, how are you going to gather the means in order just to get food, and get by? So this is, yes, this is it, there are layers. It's an infinite layers. And yeah, I think that they haven't considered, for example, in these processes of this cycle of this healthcare and disease cycle and of well-being, it's what for many looks, for example, as what is a good death, what a good death looks like for many communities. And that has so many layers and specific layers that are also important to ask and to touch on. How can we improve this? Because there are all types of faiths and all types of vulnerable groups, and so it does not only matter if you live or die, but it's also crucial to bring forth how both phenomena are experienced, in this pandemic setting and in many settings to come.
Indeed. I think I would like to touch now upon Juan Manuel's topic that he brought, because it's related somewhat to the responsibility aspect of religious studies scholars, and also not only religious studies, but social scientists in general, about his text that he shared with us, The Dead of Historians, How Modern Extremists Abuse the Medieval Past. If you could introduce shortly to your topic, I think because we are
Okay,
running
I
out of
mean,
time
this
a
is
little
going
bit.
to be a little bit farther away, but I will try to link it because I think that the fundamental point of how do we create images about reality from our cultural perspectives and how that impacts our real world, I'll try to link it through that. So the book that Sidney mentioned was written, came out this year and was written by two medieval historians called Amy Kaufman Paul Sturtevant. And the book is really pretty much about how the images that we create about the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages in particular, because it has this fame of either being the romantic period of chivalry or the dark ages of religious fanaticism and superstition, how are they used to promote political ideas today?
Mhm.
And when I started reading the book, it really caught my attention because I think it comes from something of a personal experience. I always tell everybody that the reason why I study history is because I used to play a lot of video games when I was little, and I still do. And many of my first contacts with history was through video games and through movies. And all surprised when I started actually studying history at the university level to find out how many of the things that I have come to believe were quote unquote true were really not. And but then that got me thinking not only how does, for example, me seeing religion in the Middle Ages configures what I thought I knew about the Middle Ages, but also what do I think about my present today? And that's kind of the point that the book is trying to make. How the way in which we perceive a particular idea, call it a religious idea, historical idea, ends up configuring the way that we understand the world. I researched about the Crusades, I said in the introduction, and I was reading last night a very interesting book chapter from a historian called Nicholas Haydock. He wrote a book in 2008 about movie medievalisms and the images of the Middle Ages in movies. And in one of the chapters, he talks about a movie called Kingdom of Heaven from 2005. I don't know if you know it. It's
Yeah, I've
this
seen
movie
it.
with Orlando Bloom about the Crusades and with Jeremy Irons and
Saladin appears there
and
as well, no?
Saladin, exactly, like the period right before the Third Crusade. And what in one of the main points in which the author was talking about in the chapter is that the movie could be read in very different ways depending on your political ideas and your religious ideas that you already brought with you. So, for example, he mentioned how there is this, or there was because he already died, this very famous British Crusade academic called Jonathan Riley Smith. He's something like the historian that for the last 50 or 60 years kind of brought the torch of Crusaders were not savages, fanatics who were manipulated just to plunder and enrich themselves. They actually had sincere religious convictions to what they were doing because medieval mentality is very different from ours. And when the movie was shown to him, the first thing that he said was, "This movie is like fuel for Al Qaeda, and it's fuel for Osama bin Laden, because the movie depicts the typical crusader as greedy, as cruel, as fanatic, as zealous, as greedy, and all these very negative images that we have." But then when the movie was shown to another scholar who is a Muslim professor, I think, I don't remember exactly which was the university, he saw it in the opposite way. In his eyes, the whole movie showed the Muslims like barbarians and savages and killing in the name of God. And actually the movie had like weird things going on about it. And after he discusses all this thing, the author poses a very, very important question, because he says, for example, Riley Smith, the first academic that I mentioned, he says that if we just accept that, for example, medieval people were completely different from ours, we are really omitting the important debate, and is how do we use these images in order to configure our vision of the world. So, of course, after the September 11th, for example, the topic of the crusade became again very relevant, because it was again this like kind of conflict between the Christian civilization and Muslim civilization. But although we cannot really make that connection, I don't think we can seriously argue that something that happened 500 or 1,000 years ago has relevance to the policy today. What it is very relevant is what is the image of that past that we have. Actually, the book mentions a very interesting case of American soldiers that were wearing these patches in the uniforms, and it showed the image of a crusader eating something like a pork leg, and it said "poor pork eating crusader," both in English and in Arabic, in order to tease their rivals. So just using that image already kind of tell us what the soldier thinks their war is about. So although it's a little bit of a far-fetched topic compared to what we were discussing before related to COVID, I think we could bring it to the point in which, in the end, these different cultural frameworks that are reproduced by society itself, not only in discourse or in public speeches, but through media or through art, end up configuring our vision of the policies that need to be taken or how to tackle different problems. Call it seeing the relationship between today Christianity and Islam as if it was a crusade, or seeing the biomedicine of native communities as something that is not valid compared to the science of Western civilization. So I think that's kind of like the link that one could try to make. It's a speech that is not brought through official channels, but through culture in general. That can include newspaper. I mean, just maybe to give a final connection, because maybe this also happens in Chile and in Peru. But to say in Colombia that you're a native or that you're an Indian has very specific connotations.
Of course.
That I think also influences the way in which, for example, in a situation like this one, a government chooses to approach the pandemic problem to a community. Is not only that they are different, is maybe that their medicine is not as good as ours, because the native is not the same, doesn't have the same ontological value as, for example, Western medicine. And this can also apply from this perspective, or to claim Muslims are always the same. The Muslim of the Crusades 1,000 years ago is exactly the same as the Muslim today.
And which are not taking into account that they're all different. It depends where, how they live their practices in different parts of the world. A Muslim in Singapore is very different to one in another geography, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so those things aren't even subtleties. They are they're huge breaches that finally are generalized by the media, by politicians, and it gives you a mainstream view of public opinion too.
Exactly.
It's the perception of alterity at the end, no?
Sorry?
It's the perception of alterity at the end, how people perceive the other in one way, and how they build hierarchies from that point. And this translates to any kind of societal level, from the most community-based to the most like statewide, nationwide, or region-wise even. So it's finally depending on that how you manage that the view of alterity. It will depend what kind of outcomes in practices and very specific things like policies can generate. So I think it's a very anthropological question. We are running out of time, so I would like to ask each of you if you have any final comments on what we have discussed so far. Which are very diverse topics, but I think there are some kind of like underlying lines that we can draw with one another.
Yeah, maybe the one thing that I would like maybe try to conclude what I believe could be like the point of all of the discussion that we've been having today is that the cultural framework from which we work has very tangential consequences, even if we are not always conscious about them. Just thinking just claiming you stay at home and wash your hands as much as you can is talking from a cultural framework that does not necessarily match somebody else's, like in the case of the native communities in Latin America, and that can very easily be applied to cultural media. Why do we portray Muslims in a way? Why do we portray Crusaders in a way? Why do we portray natives in a way? What is the type of systemic speech that this portrayal is representing that in the end configures how we see problems and how we tackle them from a policy perspective?
Indeed.
And to a certain degree, this kind of this is part of this kind of global disease that kind of has the same remedy, and we all have to do the same thing in a way. It's kind of really undermining in a way, how we are different, because we all have to wear masks and we all have to, do certain things. So it's it's no wonder that it's kind of interesting to look at how different communities, react to this.
I actually maybe would add one final thing about what Stephanie mentioned, and it is again this individualistic approach to medicine to this more communal one, and is that if you actually think about it, a pandemic, because of the nature of what it is, should in principle maybe be treated in community, not as individuals, because the problem of a pandemic is that it will hit us all at the same time. Yet both the approach, the policies, and the responsibility is still taking us everyone for himself.
Exactly. And that's their sense of carrying a discourse in media and in policies, and in this biomedical lens that's specifically targeted to individual behavior. I mean, in that sense, it's their way of bringing community together to comply under that lens. That's their communal vision, which many don't see, that it's not communal. There are other things to be considered, many other variables, and that has to also do with each geography. It's not one pill that will tackle the whole world. It's not one perception. And this also not only pertains to pandemics, of course, it pertains so many other issues, which is also human rights.
Exactly.
Human rights, which is, and that obviously human rights in broadly, and then you have gender, you have
economic inequality,
you have indigenous peoples, etc. So yes, and religious, and then you have all of this, which is freedom of speech in a way, which is just another topic in itself, and it's for another podcast.
I would like to thank you, all of you, for being part of the Discourse episode this time. Unfortunately, we have already exceeded the time that we are for this recording, but I certainly hope that we can have you again in another edition of Discourse episode. So I would just like to thank all of you and hope to see you again
for the invitation.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.